The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Hi, I'm Charney, and this is the Charney Report. And today we have a fascinating historian, former Knesset member of the Labor Party Inner Circle, a man who really knows Israel on the back of his hand, who's written a very, very important book called Bitter Scent. And it's a story of sort of a Nazi infiltration. I wouldn't call it infiltration. How the Nazis were involved in L'Oreal, which is a very big cosmetic firm. And it's sort of a history of an interesting man called Jean Friedman, who was willing to attack these people. My guest is Michael Bar-Zohar, and I met him about 15, 20 years ago when he was doing the Ben Gurion biography. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's my pleasure, Leon. Good evening.
You have so much to talk about. First of all, your book is terrific. I read your book. It's a must-read. And it's a small book. It's not a big one. People could take it in their pockets practically. But it's a fascinating story about this fellow Friedman, who was a great resistance fighter.
Right.
And he took on, and then he went into communications, made some money, but he took on L'Oreal because he found out the Nazis were really trying to push him down a little bit. No one believed it, huh?
It was a very strange story. This man was really a real hero of the French resistance. He fought the Nazis, right. He was condemned to death, he escaped by the skin of his teeth, and then he becomes a partner of L'Oreal in a company, and one day he finds out that secretly he had been kicked off his position as vice president without even knowing. And he finds it has been done by a fraudulent meeting of the board which never took place, a letter of resignation which was never written. And when he tries to find out who did that to him, he discovers behind the scenes a man who is a French Nazi criminal, Jacques Corrèze, who did it in order to yield to the Arab boycott and to take out of the company anybody who has connections to Israel. And this Jacques Corrèze was actually the president of the sister company of L'Oreal here in New York. For 30 years, he had lived in New York under his real name.
And he was a Nazi.
As a Nazi. Yes, he was the man actually responsible for the confiscation of the Jewish property in Paris during the war. And he was here, and he had many Jewish friends. He knew very well Helena Rubinstein.
That's when they brought Helena Rubinstein to Israel as a cover.
And he bought Helena Rubinstein's company for L'Oreal.
Wow.
And that's the way the boycott story started, because Helena Rubinstein had been boycotted by L'Oreal because she had a plant in Israel. And the moment it was bought by L'Oreal, immediately the Arab boycott extended the boycott over L'Oreal as well. And they had to save the company.
There was a prosecutor there, or what they call in French. He was the hero of the book,
He was
really.
the hero. That's a French district attorney, what
Right.
we would call it in this country.
Right.
In France, it would be a judge of instruction, because they have a judge
Right.
who actually acts as the district attorney, prepares the case, and then brings the file to the court. And this guy was a very brave guy. He was told, don't touch this
Right.
subject.
It goes high up. I mean, it
Don't
goes
touch
to
it, because
Mitterrand.
there was-
Everybody was involved
exactly,
there.
there was a connection, very close connection to Mitterrand. It was a very strange story, because when you go back, it's a story of three friends who went to university together in the late 30s.
Right.
One of them became the richest man in France and the owner of L'Oreal. The second became the best manager in France and the CEO of L'Oreal. The third one became the president of France. And that was a very close connection. And that's why when the affair exploded in Paris, Mitterrand, who had actually pledged to support and to promote the anti-boycott laws in France, said to his advisors, get Friedman out of this story. Who needs that story? And they called Friedman and told him, listen, the president asks you to drop the charges.
And he didn't do it.
He did it. He believed that the president was doing it for the good of France, that he was going to investigate and do something, because he didn't know about the secret connection of Mitterrand with the entire story.
But Friedman and his brother
Yes.
took on the whole French establishment.
Right.
Is the case settled yet, by the way?
No, there are about 18 different trials going on.
Really?
But from my point of view, the case is settled because
He proved that the Nazis were there?
the Nazis were there, and finally there was an end to the story. The bad guys are out. First of all, Corrèze resigned from L'Oréal and died. Betancourt, the owner of L'Oréal, did not run anymore for senator and resigned from his position as vice president of L'Oréal, and in a kind of poetic justice gave his seat at the board of L'Oréal to his son-in-law, whose name is Myers.
He was
who is
Jewish.
and his grandparents had perished in Auschwitz.
It's unbelievable.
And L'Oréal itself decided to make amends, and they're now investing in Israel. They bought a cosmetics company in Israel, and they're helping a lot of good causes in Israel and in this country. So from the point of view of our story, it's wonderful. The bad guys are gone, the good guys have won, and the story has an ending.
Who put you onto this book?
Well, I knew Friedman for many years, and I knew about the story, but was very interested.
Friedman
And
was
then-
very active in helping Shimon Peres all the time.
Right, exactly. He supported him very, very strongly in Israel.
Right.
And one day he asked me to arrange a meeting between him and Avram Burg, who is today the chairman of the Jewish Agency.
Right.
And Burg was a very close friend of mine. Friedman wanted to warn Burg that very soon a lot of new revelations are going to be made public about Betancourt, the owner of L'Oréal's past, which was also a past very close to collaboration with the Nazis. He had published quite a lot of anti-Jewish and anti-Allied articles during the war. And I arranged this meeting, and Friedman told Burg the entire story from the beginning to the end. And I said, yeah, there is a book here. But on the other hand, I didn't want to make a book about Jean Friedman because I wanted it to be an objective historical book. So I decided to go, first of all, to Paris and find out if I can get the documents about the entire story.
You speak
And
French?
Yes, I lived in France for 7 years, and that was my second mother's language, actually. So I went and I got all the French documents about it, all the testimonies before the police inquiry. I met the judge, the police officers who were in charge of the thing, and slowly the entire story started to emerge. And the most dramatic thing was that in 99% of the cases, you wouldn't have known about it, I wouldn't have known about it. They would have just killed the story. But this district attorney, the Judge Jetty, he was a brave guy.
He's the hero of the book.
Yes, because he decided, in spite of all the warnings he was given not to touch the subject, he took 40 police officers one morning at 7 o'clock, and he burst into the headquarters of L'Oréal and also into the private apartments of all the top executives of the company. And L'Oréal were so secure and so serene that nobody would touch them, that they even didn't try to shred the documents. And the police officer just went down into the archives and found all the exchange of letters with the boycott bureau in Damascus. And they found every needed piece of evidence to prove that L'Oréal had actually yielded to the Arab boycott against Israel.
How long did it take you to write the book?
2 years.
Is it in French also?
Yes, it
Was
came in
big
France.
seller in France?
Oh, yes, yes. Wonderful reviews in Le Monde, in the various French newspapers.
Who's the publisher in the United States?
Dutton,
Dutton Books.
yes.
It's all over. It's a riveting book. People really must read that book. It's fascinating. And it's got so many things in it. You know, the hero, anti-hero, the non-Jewish judge, the prosecutor, the brothers who fought and then they got together, the Friedman brothers. I mean, I remember the whole
Yes.
book. I read it from page to page. It was terrific. And is it going to be published in Israel also?
Oh, it was published in Israel already.
Yes. Idiot?
Yes, yes, exactly.
Idiot?
Yes,
It's a
it
fascinating
came out,
book.
and Israel even made a special program about the book. They sent a crew to Paris. They made like a Nightline special program of 55 minutes, and they interviewed everybody concerned in Paris, and it was a big success.
Michael, you have been in the Knesset. You're a big politician in a sense because you're part of the Labor Party, and events have transpired that are unbelievable. But we have a full hour, so I want to trace back. First of all, you're a historian. You're the known historian of David Ben-Gurion.
Right.
You've written how many books about him?
I wrote about him about 5 books.
5 books.
Yes.
And you
Different
spent.
biographies.
How did you get close to Ben-Gurion?
Well, that was the mystery of my life. I was very young. I was 24, 25. I just finished my PhD, which was about the Suez War in 1956. The secret relation between France and Israel, the secret trip of Ben Gurion to France to sign an agreement with the French and English leaders. So I wrote this PhD thesis. I made it into a book. It came out in France and in Israel. It was my first book. And it got a lot of
People may have
award.
forgotten, but Israel and France got together to challenge Egypt in the Suez, along with Britain. The United States came out against it. Eisenhower got very strong, and he pushed everybody back. It's a capsule form, right?
Yes, that was November 1956.
And Uri Ben Ari lost his generalship.
Colonel Uri Ben, that's true. And I sent a copy of the book to Ben Gurion, and with a nice dedication. He sent me a very warm letter. And I was very young, I had a lot of cheek. So I went to his secretary and said, tell Ben Gurion that I want to write his biography. But on one condition, mind you, that he would give me all these black notebooks. There were black notebooks he was keeping in his office, in which he was writing his private diary. Nobody had seen them before. And of course, I was sure that it was just a joke. He would never trust me for that, because quite a lot of world-known historians had turned to Ben Gurion, and he had refused. And then 2 weeks later, the secretary of Ben Gurion calls me and says, that's okay, he waits for you tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock.
Wow.
I said, what do you
blew
mean?
your mind, right?
What do you mean he waits for me? He said, it's okay, you asked for something. Ben Gurion agrees. So I thought there was a misunderstanding. Perhaps he had agreed to meet me and to discuss with me my request. So I spent the whole night writing a memorandum of 60 pages, explaining that I was able to write this biography. That I come to Ben Gurion's house, and I passed the obstacle, which was Mrs. Ben Gurion, Paula Ben Gurion, because that was the question. If you go through the barricade, which is Paula, and go up to the first floor, and I walk into Ben Gurion's room, very nervous. He says, you're Bar-Zohar, sit down. I sit down and said, Mr. Ben Gurion, I brought this memo. He said, yes, yes. What are the questions? I said, Mr. Ben Gurion, I brought you the memo. He said, what are the questions? I was desperate. I said, what question? He said, you are my biographer, aren't you? What do you want to know?
Wow.
And that's the way it started. I asked Teddy Kollek and Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Navon, go speak to the old man, find out why did he pick me up.
Right.
Of course, it was a wonderful choice. But he never said. I think I came at the right moment, and he was impressed perhaps by my first book.
Everybody, every historian in the world want to write his biography.
Yes.
He
and, to live with George Washington and Abe Lincoln together,
right. It's tremendous.
For 9 years, and to be able to follow every day the way they act, and to see the charisma in action. Because most historians...
You stayed with him for how many years?
9 years.
9 years?
But I went home to sleep because I would have got a divorce from my wife. So I was going every morning to his home, and when he was in Sde-Boker, I was going down to Sde-Boker.
He did a thing called Feldenkrais, didn't he? Some kind of yoga,
yes,
Feldenkrais
very
yoga?
Special, yes, a very special kind of physical therapy. Yes.
How great!
And then he stood on his head,
right.
Which was also a kind of source for jokes for the entire Israeli people. What kind of prime minister is that who stands on his head every day?
What kind of man was Ben Gurion? Genius?
First of all, he was a very shy man. He was a very shy man. He was extremely able in the field of abstraction. He could write or read anything abstract, like philosophy, religion, political science. He was very bad in fiction. He couldn't write a novel or tell you a story. And he had no interest in that at all. I couldn't take him to a movie.
Really?
No, he would like a movie about something which is documentary, an interview or something about a war, about a kibbutz, something which gives you the facts of life, but never a
Didn't
story.
want to waste time.
Now, he was also a man who had been very deeply wounded in his heart since his youth. First of all, his mother died when he was 11 years old, and she was the closest person to him. And he felt very lonely. Then his father married a second woman who became his stepmother,
Right.
and he didn't like it.
Didn't get along with her.
And the third blow which he received was the fact that he came to Israel, to Palestine at the time, in 1906.
Didn't he get a law degree in Turkey at one time?
He went afterwards for a law degree, that's true. Afterwards he went to Turkey for a law degree. But when he came to Palestine, the first time he came with his girlfriend, whom he loved very, very dearly, Rachel. And because of all kind of problems, she finally married somebody else.
Really?
And he never forgave
He
himself.
was heartbroken, huh?
Never forgave himself. I spoke to him the last time, about 6 months before his death. And he said, the only woman I loved, said the only woman I loved was Rachel.
She was an Israeli, Jewish?
Yes.
And she married someone
I spoke
else?
to her as well. She married someone else.
Who did she
It
marry?
was his fault.
Who did she marry?
A man called Yecheskel Bet Alachmi.
Did you ever talk to her?
Of course.
Did she regret not marrying Ben Gurion?
She was too shy to say it. She would just laugh. I brought them together. I did a movie about Ben Gurion's life, which was called BG Remembers, in which I made him meet all the people who were symbolic and important in his life. And I brought him to Israel on a boat to the port of Jaffa and said, here I landed in 1906. I was with my girlfriend Rachel, and there she came and took him by the hand, and they walked in front of the camera. And he regretted very much. But I told him once, that Ben Gurion, perhaps that was for the good of Israel, because if you had married Rachel, you would have been so happy. You would have built a house or a farm and lived all your life happily ever after.
All right, on that statement, we're going to cut for a commercial break. We'll come right back. I mean, it's an interesting philosophical question. Would he be better off with the love of his life, and whether Israel had suffered? Great question. No one has the answer. We'll be right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie. Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels is now available in bookstores and online in paperback and an ebook for both Kindle and Nook. It's a great way to learn how history was made behind the scenes. Get it at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Be a witness to history. Order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon.com or buy it at Barnes & Noble and get the real story behind the making of the 1978 Camp David Accords. In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
See Backdoor Channels Wednesday, September 26th at 7 p.m. on New York's WLIW Channel 21.
We're back with a fascinating man called Michael Bar-Zohar, who's written a riveting book called Bitter Scent, which is the case L'Oreal, Nazis and the Arab Boycott. I don't even have to, I memorized it. I know the book by heart. You've just heard a lot about it. Aside from that, Mickey, we call him in Israel, has been a member of Knesset for 2 stints, as we say, and he's informed about Israel as well as anybody in the world. And more importantly, or perhaps as important, he is the official biographer of David Ben Gurion, and we're talking about him right now. So David Ben Gurion got stuck on a love story, and Israel got some gain out of it, right?
I guess so, because, if he was happy with his wife, perhaps he would never created the state of Israel.
Where did he meet Paula?
He met Paula in New York. During the First World War, he was exiled by the Turks from Palestine, which was a part of the Turkish Empire. So he came to New York. He was very lonely, and she fell in love with him.
Was she American? No, Paula?
She was Russian. But she lived in New York. She had come to New York a few years before. She was very happy here. She didn't want to go to Palestine. She was not a Zionist. She wanted to. She was a chief nurse in the hospital in
Reminds me of the Chaim Weitzman story with Vera Weitzman, who basically didn't want to go to Israel either.
Yes.
So now Paula has to go with the leader.
Paula has to go with
George Washington of Israel.
Exactly, and she didn't like it. She came to Israel and she complained that you can't blame her, because that was not her dream.
Right.
And he dreamt of the Jewish state and of bringing Jews to Israel. She had a very, very hard life, and he was traveling for lots of time, sometimes 5 or 6 months every year, spending more than 50% of his salary on books, because he was a self-learned man, and he was buying huge quantities of books. And she was alone most of the time with the children. And there, somewhere during the way, the road split, and he was the greatest feminist I ever knew. He wanted from the start to have a wife who is going to be totally, absolutely his equal, to be able to tell her his problems, to ask for advice. He saw it like the way Lenin, the Russian leader, had this wife, Krupskaya, was very strong.
A partner.
Yes, a partner.
Hillary.
He looked for a partner.
And he didn't get it.
No.
And she was passive?
She was not interested. And there is a letter which she wrote her in 1938 saying, I'm trying so hard to be with you, and I need you so much, and I write to you, and you don't answer, and I feel myself like I'm living in a cold ice desert without anybody around me.
Terrible.
And this solitude was one of the major parts of his life. He was always a very, very lonely man.
How about his children? Amos?
3 children.
3 children.
Geula was the first, his daughter, who became a teacher afterwards. His son was Amos, and his 3rd child was Renana. Of her he was the most proud, because Renana became a professor of microbiology, very, very smart, very, very active and dynamic woman. And she did it all by herself. When she went to study, she changed her name. She didn't want anybody to know that she's Ben-Gurion's daughter. And she became a scientist on her own right.
Did Ben-Gurion have a military mind?
He wanted very much to be like Churchill as Churchill was in the Second World War, Ben-Gurion was in the War of Independence. And many of the operations and the basic strategy were his conception. First of all, he realized before anybody else that Israel would not be created without a terrible, bloody war between the Arabs and Israel. In 1946, he already understood that Israel must buy now weapons, tanks, cannon, planes, which the Israeli Haganah and the Irgun had never heard about. And he wanted to bring huge quantities of heavy arms and to prepare them for this war against the Arab invasion. Nobody believed him, but he said...
Let's say 1940, 42, did he believe there'd be a Jewish state? Did he have
Yes.
He had
Yes.
a premonition?
In the Second World War, he believed that this war can bring to a Jewish state, because he realized that this is a certain moment in history when the entire world is changed and being remade from the beginning. And he understood that the same way as the First World War brought to the Jewish people the Balfour Declaration, which created the Jewish national home in Palestine, the Second World War should bring a Jewish state.
So that's why he was a prophet.
That's decided during the war that now let's put aside all the other goals. Our goal from now on is going to be the creation of a Jewish state. And in 1942, in the Biltmore Hotel in New York, which was since demolished, he published the Balfour Declaration, saying that the goal of the Zionist movement, the Jewish people, was the creation of a Jewish state immediately after the war. That became the new flag of the Jewish people, the new slogan, and that's what happened.
The Lavon Affair, this disrupted his whole life. What happened to him?
Yes.
We have to explain the Lavon Affair. This was when Lavon became a defense minister. He allegedly allowed some people in Egypt to become, or some Israeli spies to disrupt Egypt in order to get world opinion against Egypt. Is that an encapsulation? The
English were going to leave Egypt. They had a lot of bases in Egypt. And Israel felt that the English presence in Egypt was a very stabilizing factor. They didn't want the British to leave and to go home. So they tried to keep the British in Egypt by a very childish scheme, by planting amateurish bombs in a couple of cinemas, which would impress the British that the Egyptians were unreliable, so they would stay. That was ridiculous. It would have been ridiculous if it hadn't cost the life of people.
Right.
2 Jews were hanged in Egypt because of that, and 2 others died. One committed suicide, and one was tortured apparently to death in Cairo. And that was apparently an order given by Minister of Defense Lavon. And years after it happened, Lavon had to resign finally from his position, Minister of Defense.
Did he ever admit it, Lavon? Did he ever admit?
No.
He never admitted it.
He always claimed that was a machination, that was defamation. It had never happened.
Right.
And in 1960, Lavon discovered new material which he thought supported his position. And he went to fight in order to clear his name. Now, Ben-Gurion in the beginning did not interfere in the affair. He said, you have material, go to the courts and let them decide whatever. But when Lavon started attacking the defense establishment, the Israeli army, the Israeli Ministry of Defense, for Ben-Gurion that was a religion.
Couldn't bear it.
He was so proud of the greatest achievement of Israel, to have this young, wonderful, ethical and moral army with a very high scale of values, that he decided that he goes to fight against Lavon with all his power. But Ben-Gurion was not very young anymore. He was an old man. His reactions were slow. His political instincts, which were extremely sharp, were already lost. So he started making big mistakes. And the Lavon Affair finally brought to his downfall. And I wrote that in the first biography I wrote about Ben-Gurion, and I criticized him very strongly about the Lavon Affair. And he was mad at me. If he could have cut me to pieces. I was in Paris, the book was published, and he wrote me a terrible letter. And I came back to see him. He was in his suite in the King David Hotel. And he was red in the face. And he was yelling at me, why do you write your opinions? Just put the facts. The writer should not put his opinions. And could you imagine, Leon, think about yourself standing in front of George Washington, of a piece of history. What can you do to him? I said to him just one thing, I said, Ben-Gurion, when I go with you in the political life, wherever you go, I go. You split the Labour Party, you want to create your own party, Rafi for a while, I went with you. But when I write, my duty is toward history, not toward you. I have to write what I feel is the right thing. No, he yelled at me and he pounded the table. You had to see Ben-Gurion angry.
I don't want to.
And the following day, the whole day didn't speak to me. We were together in a big convention. And in the evening, Rerun, his youngest daughter, comes to me and says, Michael, would you have 5 copies of the book? I said, why? And she said, father would like to give them to his grandchildren as a present. Aha, I said, okay. So I went to see Ben-Gurion and said, look, now I'm starting the second stage of my research, a large 3-volume biography in Hebrew. Would you help me? I said, of course, you're my biographer, aren't you? So he had kind of a very strong moral attitude, understanding what are the limits he would put.
He's a great man.
Yes.
Was he a prophet?
He was a prophet armed with a calculator. He didn't have a mind of let's say, wild vision and imagination, but he had a very strong sense of realities. He was a very good chess player. Not a prophet, but a chess player. Well, he would tell you, Leon, when he plays chess with you, he would tell you, checkmate in the 17th move. Because he would always calculate, and then he would speak, he would say things which would seem prophetical. I was with him in 1964, when he was interviewed by a team of Life magazine, who were asking great statesmen, what would the world be in 25 years? And said, in 25 years, the Soviet Union will crumble down.
Really? He predicted it?
Yes. I was there. And he said, because the people would not be able to support this regime of lies and of tyranny, the Soviet Union cannot exist. It will fall down in 25 years.
You defended him lately. There's been a book out that Ben-Gurion didn't do enough for the Jews during the Holocaust.
Right.
And I don't remember who wrote the book, and you defended him. And you said he absolutely did. And he was very well aware of it. It's hard for me to believe that he wouldn't want to work towards saving Jews. But I think his greater goal always was the establishment of the Jewish state.
That was his number one goal.
Right.
But, he predicted the Holocaust. There is a letter which he wrote in 1937. It was 2 years before the World War erupted. And then he supported a British program, the Peel Plan, which was to partition Palestine and to create a small Jewish state. And all the Zionist leaders, Golda and Berl Katzenelson, all the hawks, all the tough guys were against it. All the doves, like Weizmann and others, supported. And Ben-Gurion left his friends and brothers, the hawkish camp, and moved to Weizmann and supported the plan. And his son Amos wrote him a letter and said, Father, how can you support this kind of tiny Jewish state? And Ben-Gurion said, listen,
let's start.
First of all, we shall have a state.
Right.
And as a state, we shall have an army. And then who knows what's going to happen to the Jews of Europe? If we have a state, we have a place for them. That was prophetical.
I have so many questions to ask you. Number one, what was his relationship to Chaim Weizmann? Not too good.
No.
Why?
No.
Why?
It was a dual relationship. It was an admiration. He would write him a letter full of love and admiration. He would call him, "You are the king of Israel." But on the other hand, he criticized him very strongly for not being resolute enough, not fighting the British. In a way, he was right, because Weizmann had obtained everything for the Jewish people.
This is Chaim Weizmann.
Chaim Weizmann,
right.
The uncle of our present president,
Right.
and your close friend. So Chaim Weizmann had obtained everything for the Jewish people from the British Empire, and he had become a kind of prisoner of his achievement. He was much admired by the British.
That's interesting.
Churchill and others admired Weizmann.
Right.
I have the...
Was it jealousy, Michael, you think?
A lot of jealousy.
A lot of jealousy.
A lot of jealousy. For instance, Ben-Gurion suffered from his height. He was small, he was short.
Yeah.
He would never get into the room together with Weizmann. He would wait for everybody to be seated, then he would walk in. He would never admit it. How do I know that he didn't like the fact he was short? I was at his home one day, and he said to me, "You know, my grandson Yariv came, and you see at the jamb of the door, he is getting tall. He's going to be tall. He's going to be..." He was so happy about his grandson going to be tall that you could understand where he stood. Of this
Michael, you're fascinating. We had to cut for a commercial break. We'll come right back. And I want to ask Michael about the biggest decision Ben-Gurion ever had to make in his life. That was the gunning of the Al-Talena. And that's a historic event in Jewish history, which is still, I don't think, finished. We'll be right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high to have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie. Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels is now available in bookstores and online in paperback and an ebook for both Kindle and Nook. It's a great way to learn how history was made behind the scenes. Get it at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Be a witness to history. Order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon.com or buy it at Barnes & Noble and get the real story behind the making of the 1978 Camp David Accords. In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high to have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
See Backdoor Channels Wednesday, September 26th at 7 p.m. on New York's WLIW Channel 21.
We're back. I'm here with Michael Bar-Zohar, who's out with a book called Bitter Scent. We talked about it before. It's the case of L'Oreal, Nazis and the Arab Boycott. Terrific book. And as you can tell, if you've been listening to this program, if you haven't, it's your problem, because Michael is phenomenal. He's a historian. He's a living historian of the Israeli history and the official biographer of David Ben-Gurion. Are those books in English too?
Yes.
They sell forever, probably.
Yes.
World leaders used to write to him all the time,
Yes.
Ben-Gurion?
Yes, a lot of correspondence with...
He's considered one of the greats of the 20th century.
Right.
In world leadership.
Certainly.
You know, he's up there with Churchill and probably Eisenhower.
De Gaulle wrote to me, when my first biography of Ben-Gurion was published, I sent it to President de Gaulle.
Right.
And he wrote to me, Ben-Gurion is one of the greatest leaders of our century. He had a lot of admiration for him.
Let's talk about Al-Talena. Al-Talena was a boat that was coming in with some arms, and it was being brought in basically what we call the Likud people, Cherut Party, or whatever it was. And Ben-Gurion wanted to unify Israel at that time. And he had to tell his commanders, Yitzhak Rabin was one of the commanders there, to shoot at this boat which was carrying Jewish warriors and Jewish ammunition, and it's still a topic which is very tough to talk about today. I had a woman on here who did a documentary about it. You probably have seen it. She won some prizes for it, about the Al-Talena. What you talked to Ben-Gurion about this at Lent, I'm sure. What did he say? Did he feel badly about it?
No.
Really?
Not at all. Ben-Gurion was a man who was very, very devoted to his truths. And if he didn't feel well about it, he would never say it. He would never hint it.
Really?
Because he was always a man who always looked about his place in history. And for him, it was very clear. We couldn't have somebody else but the government bringing weapons into Israel and arming a part of the army. Today, of course, it would be ridiculous if, for instance, a party like Meretz or something Red Wing would bring a boat full of weapons to arm their guys in the army. But at the time, it was still a new thing. And Ben-Gurion feared very much more than necessary. Ben-Gurion was obsessed by the idea that Menachem Begin was the leader of the Irgun underground, might try to carry out a coup and seize power in Israel. And we shall have a civil war between Ben-Gurion, the Israeli army, and the organized community, and Begin and his people. Today we know very well that there was not the slightest chance that Begin would have ever raised weapons against another part of the
I don't think it'd be in Begin's character even.
No, but at the time, there is no doubt.
They hated him. I mean,
they hated him. Ben-Gurion hated him terribly.
Did Begin hate Ben-Gurion? You don't know.
No. Begin, in a way, Begin looked for approval by Ben-Gurion. It's very strange, but both Begin and Shamir looked up at Ben-Gurion.
Interesting.
Yes, they saw in him the greatness in him. And you know, there was a scene much later, at the eve of the Sinai campaign, when Ben-Gurion invited Begin for the first time to his home. After 8 years, he didn't speak to him. You know, in the Knesset, Ben-Gurion would not talk to Begin. And when Begin would cry or shout or do something, he would say, the member of Knesset sitting beside the member of Knesset, Badr, he wouldn't pronounce his name.
And Begin was always polite.
Very polite. And that Paula the wife of Ben-Gurion, would always come and say, you see, you must learn from Begin to be gentle and polite. He is a gentleman.
Interesting.
And Ben-Gurion also, she likes him. She likes him, he would say. She thinks he's a gentleman.
Who were his closest friends, Ben-Gurion's?
Ben-Gurion's closest friends were actually people who had come with him from Poland since his youth. Yes. Right. One of them was Shlomo Tzemach, a man who came to Israel and later sank into oblivion. Another one was the founder of the large kibbutz, of the idea of the large kibbutz. Later, Ben Tzvi, the second president of Israel, after the death of Chaim Weizmann, Ben Tzvi was very, very close to him, because when they were young in Palestine, Ben Tzvi, his future wife Rachel Yanait, and Ben-Gurion were a troika which never separated. But Rachel Yanait told me once, she said, you know, I'm not sure that Ben-Gurion loved so much Ben Tzvi. He loved the fact that Ben Tzvi loves him. He knew that he can go to him, take off his coat, take off his tie, kick off his shoes, and be at home, because he had a friend who admires him, who loves him, and who is always at his side. And he needed that, to be sure that there is somebody who is not a politician fighting him or trying to take
We interviewed Shimon Peres about 10, 12 weeks ago, and Ben-Gurion's pictures all over the place, and he idolizes Ben-Gurion. How did Ben-Gurion feel about Shimon Peres, or he's too young?
Ben-Gurion cooperated with Ben-Gurion saw in Shimon Peres a man who realized what are the real goals of Israel. Because Shimon Peres built the military industry, the air industry, and the relation with France.
And the nuclear.
And that's the point. That's what I want to reach. In 1957, 40 years ago, you had two crazy people in the entire state of Israel. One was Ben-Gurion, one was Peres. They decided to give Israel a nuclear capacity. Dayan was very skeptical. Dayan was a very close friend of mine. He was very cynical. Golda Meir did not believe that we can do anything, that the Americans would let us. Eshkol said, you're not going to have the money. He said, hair will grow on my palm before you get the money for this craziness of yours. Israel, the chief of the Secret Services, said, don't you dare. Who knows what they're going to do to us? And these two crazy people did three things. First of all, they obtained the French cooperation and the French support, and the French built the reactor in Israel. Second, they went secretly throughout the world and found Jewish scientists who were ready to help. and to give their know-how. Third, they went mostly to this country and met with with a group of Jewish millionaires who were ready to give their money for that purpose, knowing that their name perhaps will never be known. And they contributed tremendous sums of money. And these two guys, Ben-Gurion, the older, and Shimon, the younger, built the nuclear reactor. And I believe it has a large part to play in the peace process today.
Absolutely.
Because the peace was not made because the Arabs suddenly fell in love with us and decided to buy Israel bonds, to give to DOJA, to join Hadassah. They don't love us very much, and we're not crazy about them either.
I agree, and I think when we worked on Camp David, especially Sadat, he understood that nuclear proliferation, even if he had something to throw at Israel, it's the proximity
of terror.
Yeah, right. The proximity is so close.
Right.
And I think that stalled, what's his name, Assad, not Assad a little bit, but during the Gulf War, even the scudding.
Yes,
I think
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein.
Definitely.
I think he held back.
I agree with you. I think that he did not arm with gas or biological weapons his Scuds because he was afraid that Israel would retaliate by nuclear power.
Mickey, I could talk to you for 2 hours, maybe 5, about Ben-Gurion. It's fascinating. We only have an hour. I'm trying to update the history a little bit. I know you were also a close friend of Yitzhak Rabin.
Yes.
And tell me, from a historical view, was Rabin a great man? Or it's too early to tell?
Well, I think that the combination Rabin-Peres was great. And I'll tell you why. They completed each other in an unbelievable way. One was the man with the vision.
Compliment,
Shimon Peres, yes, compliment. Shimon Peres had a wonderful vision. Sometimes a little bit too much,
right.
But sometimes when it's real, it's genius. Like, for instance, the secret connection with the Palestinians and the Oslo agreements, that was the mind of Shimon Peres. Rabin would have never conceived that. I spoke to Rabin very shortly before that, and he said, we have the Madrid conference, we are going to negotiate in Washington.
He was structured.
Rabin was much more square from this point.
Right.
But Shimon Peres, unfortunately, did not have the credibility in the Israeli scene.
Why?
That's an emotional thing. I was once the campaign chairman of Shimon Peres' 91 election of the campaign. And I remember that we did surveys and polls after every appearance of Peres. And people say, I don't trust him. Why don't you trust him?
It's amazing.
Somebody would say, his eyes were moving.
Right.
Another would say, he was not looking at the camera. Another would say, well, the way he speaks. Another would say, I heard that he has a factory of shirts somewhere. All kinds of stories. I think he has stock in the Tadiran company.
Right.
Oh, things stuck to him. So Peres had the vision and the record.
Yeah, it was a good partnership.
But he couldn't have implemented this agreement.
Right.
Rabin did not have the vision, but when he got a good thing, he understood it.
And the people were behind him.
He stood behind it with all his power. And that's very interesting. These two people,
who hated each other.
They started hating each other.
Right.
I remember I supported Rabin. I was the head of his Knesset staff. And then after the election, I went to see Shimon. And he told me, he was so nervous. He said, you know, they say I'm going to be the minister of what? Of the hummus. They're just laughing at me. And Rabin did not want at the beginning to have him as Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I know.
So he got him as minister. At the beginning, it was a lot of suspicion and of hatred. And slowly these two people
came together.
First of all, realized that they have nobody else to ask for advice. They were the only ones. All the others were a different generation, 10, 15 years younger. And they found out that they are the only ones who can talk to each other. And they have a common background, a common experience, and a common outlook on Israel and its future. And second, they found out that they can work together. And slowly it became, and you know, it's like in the movies, if a good producer, a good director, to have all this relationship going in a kind of crescendo until they hugged each other, or this meeting in which Rabin was killed a few minutes later.
It's an unbelievable story. I was pretty close to Rabin. You couldn't sit in the Rabin house at a time and not hear some disparaging words about Shimon Peres. Leah Rabin especially was not very keen on Shimon Peres, and they wrote about it in his biography. I mean, Rabin wrote about Peres in his biography.
Yes.
On the other hand, I read Peres's biography, Battling for Peace, and I thought it was pretty good. And he was easier on Yitzhak Rabin.
Well, that's also the character of Peres. Peres is a much gentler man. He doesn't go to extremes. Rabin was uncouth, and in that perhaps was his strength. Because people in Israel
Sabra,
will tell me,
related to it.
He's like my father. He says things sometimes in a very tough, in a very raw way, but I like him. Because Israelis are also not the nicest people in Israel is not very gentle, very kind, and very polite. So they could relate to Rabin. Peres is much more worldly, and he also knows that things have to be presented in a much nicer way. That's the difference between these two people.
Did Rabin collapse during the Six-Day War, yes or no?
Yes.
Did Asa
yes,
Weizmann save him?
Yes, definitely. And
they never overcame
Rabin never forgave Weizmann for having seen him in his weakness.
Well, I could talk about that personally. Yes. You could interview me on that subject. I'm an expert on that one. But they were both great warriors. They both fought for their country, and who knows? Now let's up to date. You're in Emory University. You have a fellowship studying down there, and lo and behold, Yasser Arafat comes down to Plains, Georgia today. How do you put that into your computer?
I would lie if I would say I'm very happy. But on the other hand, I think that this is the result, the fruit of peace. And it's very important that not only he comes to Plains, Georgia, but he also speaks to a group of Jewish leaders in New York.
And they wait to see him.
Yes, and I think that we have to create as much connections as possible. I was yesterday in a dialogue with a Palestinian professor. We spoke about the future of peace. And he said something very true. He said, of all the Arab peoples, we, the Palestinians, are the ones who are going to really live in peace with Israel because we have no other choice. We're so much intertwined. That's going to be a common life.
You're doomed to live together.
Exactly. And therefore, I believe that the fact that Arafat will find out, first of all, the Jewish people doesn't hate him. And even find support. And we shall support Arafat in his efforts to give now an economic basis to this peace, because that's the next goal. Signatures are very nice, and pulling out of the cities is very nice. But if the Palestinian doesn't feel that he has gained something from the peace process, that his personal life is better, this peace process won't hold very much. So our next goal, which is much more difficult, is to help the Palestinians, the entire world, the Israelis and the others, to help the Palestinians to create an economy in which the people would be able to live as dignified human beings.
All right, Mickey, what do you tell the Americans here who are very pro-right-wing and really believe in a West Bank and no land for peace, etc., etc.?
Well, I would say that they are not even in step with the Likud anymore, because
they've been marginalized. Bibi Netanyahu went right to the center, and he did a Clinton, as we say. He watched the polls, he went to the center, and he marginalized the right. They have no place to go, really.
But I believe there's going to be even something more in the future, because the moment the Palestinian problem reaches this or that kind of solution, we shall find that the mainstream of the Likud and the mainstream of the Labour Party won't have any differences between them in the future. Because what is the difference between us today? The questions of land for peace.
Right.
But when tomorrow this question is behind us, we shall be much closer, and then we can have a kind of mainstream coalition between Bibi's Likud and I don't know who's going to be the Labour Party, but the mainstream of the Labour Party, and then I think we can solve the problems that today we are so dangerous.
I think you're right, and in a perverse way, everyone who is afraid of this new law of direct election of prime minister, in a sense, without this new law, it could never have happened. Bibi Netanyahu could have never signed the Hebron Agreement had the old law been in existence.
Yes.
And
exactly.
And everybody was against it for a while. So it's fascinating. I mean, it's the only place in the world that you have a prime minister and half executive, half in the legislative. But
well, I'll tell you, I was among the first four who started it. It was started by four people. By Uzi Lando, who changed his opinion later, Shevach Weiss was the Speaker of the Knesset, Bibi Netanyahu, and myself. We were the four first members of Knesset who came and said we're going to fight now for change for reforming the elections.
All right, we're going to cut for a commercial break. We'll come right back with this fascinating Man, I don't know why we never had him on before. Michael Ben-Zohar, it's our loss and your loss because you haven't seen him, and definitely has an open invitation whenever he's in town to come back. We'll be right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high to have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Get the book that inspired the award-winning movie. Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels is now available in bookstores and online in paperback and an ebook for both Kindle and Nook. It's a great way to learn how history was made behind the scenes. Get it at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Be a witness to history. Order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon.com or buy it at Barnes & Noble and get the real story behind the making of the 1978 Camp David Accords. In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high to have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
See Backdoor Channels Wednesday, September 26th at 7 p.m. on New York's WLIW Channel 21.
We're back. We're talking with Michael Bar-Zohar, former member of Knesset. More importantly, maybe not as who knows? It's hard to say. He was the official biographer of David Ben-Gurion, one of the great leaders of this century, not only Jewish but leader. And he's authored a new book called Bitter Scent: The Case of L'Oreal, Nazis and the Arabs Boycott. It's a fascinating story, riveting book, and you must read it. It's terrific. It'll probably be made into a movie, Mickey, no?
I hope so.
I think so. I mean, it's a great...
It has all the ingredients
It has
of a
all
movie,
the ingredients of a great movie.
But if I had written this book as a novel, my publisher would have kicked me off the stairs.
No,
you would never have believed it.
No. What's usually the case?
Yes. Reality is much, much stranger than fiction.
Let's run through a few Israeli personalities that I'm sure you knew very well. Moshe Dayan.
Yes. I was a friend of Moshe Dayan, and on the last day of the Six-Day War, I was fighting in the Sinai. And the last day I was on the Suez Canal. I was just a sergeant in the paratroopers. I'm not a general. And I got a phone call from Dayan saying, tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, you become the press advisor of the foreign defense minister. I said, Moshe, you're crazy. You know where I am? I'm in the Suez Canal. I said, okay. He said, make it 8:30. And that's the way I started working with him.
Was he cold?
No. Dayan was a very good friend, a very warm and very romantic man, very romantic.
Really?
Who was in love for about 17 years with a woman.
Rachel.
Rachel.
He got his Rachel.
Yes, he got his Rachel. And he would read her poems by the moonlight. He would bring her flowers. He was extreme. He had a very romantic streak in his heart. He understood the Arabs. He predicted the Intifada.
Really?
There is one of his speeches. He says, as long as the Arabs live without without being bothered by us, we can have a kind of peaceful coexistence. But the moment they are going to start to throw rocks at us and to protest in the streets in thousands, we are in big trouble. That will happen if you don't know how to handle the problem. He realized they respected him very much. He tried to see Arafat in 1969. He wanted, or 70, he wanted already to meet with Yasser Arafat because he thought that we should try and find a way to speak to our enemies, because tomorrow they're going to be our partners. He had a very original mind, but to him happened exactly what happened in so many stories in the Greek mythology, when you fell asleep on your laurels. And that's what happened to him in 1973. He felt Israel was strong.
He blew the war.
He was strong, and yes.
True story or
not. But you know, because of that, he made a peace afterwards.
True story or not, Uri Ben-Ari, is a friend of mine, was Aluf Mishneh. He was a colonel down in the Suez, and Chaim Bar-Lev was down there. Really was a hero of the Yom Kippur War. Everybody tells me that Dayan collapsed. Is that fact or not fact?
Not the Suez Canal. Yes, not physically, but he
Emotionally.
Emotionally, he told Gold that he wanted to go on television and warn the people of the danger of the collapse of the Third Temple. That's the way we used to call the State of Israel, the Third Temple of Jerusalem. And Golda was then very strong. Said, "No way, you don't go on television." After a couple of days, he recovered. And
did he admit it?
No.
No.
No, of course not.
Interesting.
But I believe that finally, things in history have a very strange way of compensating. I was with Dayan when he was writing his autobiography. I was coming every day almost to see him.
Right.
He was typing his biography. And then he told me he was very busy with the end of the book, the last chapter. This commission and that commission, they cleared me, they said, "I'm not responsible." And they said, "Moshe, when Ben-Gurion was so obsessed by the Lavon Affair, you were laughing at him for being obsessed. Now you're doing the same thing. You're obsessed by your Lavon Affair, by the
Yom Kippur War.
And you can't finish your story like that." And then I realized Moshe Dayan needs another chapter in his life. And that's why when Begin asked him to become foreign minister, he jumped and he grabbed the opportunity. And he fought so hard for the peace with Egypt. And that really changed his place in Israel's history. He added a chapter to his life, finally.
Was he a brave man?
Very brave. And he too brave, I would say. He didn't have the instinct of fear.
His military secretary, Ilan Tehila, told me that he would walk through a graze of bullets and
without realizing there is a danger. The instinct of fear didn't exist for him. Yes.
What did Ben-Gurion think of Dayan?
Oh, he loved him.
Really?
He loved him. Ben-Gurion loved Dayan very much, yes. I wouldn't say it about anybody else. Ben-Gurion admired, for a very strange reason, Yigael Yadin, and thought that he was the best for prime minister after him, which is the total, complete, absolute mistake.
Levi Eshkol followed him. I thought he was pretty good.
Ben-Gurion did not.
No, I know. They hate each other.
Of course.
It's jealousy.
And you don't like your
Small
successor.
man with jealousy is tough bargain.
But Ben-Gurion loved Moshe Dayan and saw in him the future of Israel, the hero, the young Israeli which he admired very much. It was a very soft spot in Ben-Gurion for Dayan.
And Teddy Kollek?
Oh, Teddy Kollek. Teddy Kollek was the only one who could do with Ben-Gurion whatever he wanted.
Is that right?
You have to realize, I'm sitting with Ben-Gurion. Everybody who comes to meet him is crisp and afraid and intimidated by this personality of Ben-Gurion. Teddy walks in. He has stolen an apple from the kitchen from Paula. Paula yells and screams at him. And Teddy says, "Hi, Ben-Gurion, how are you?" He sits down on the floor and starts eating his apple. And Ben-Gurion would pat his shoulder and said, "Look at Teddy, look at him. Look at him, naughty boy." That was Teddy. It was the charm was oozing from everywhere. And I just regret that Teddy Kollek did not go into the main political direction. He could have been also a good prime minister for Israel.
Mickey, you're a pleasure. You got to come back. You promise?
With pleasure.
Bitter Scent, L'Oreal. You got to read that book. It is phenomenal. We'll see you next week.